Hi guys, in this video we will cover how to create depth of field in Arnold. Now, in order to create depth of field, you need to activate that setting on the camera. And in order to do this, you need to have a camera on the scene. So right now in this scene, we have these little statuettes of cats. I'm going to go ahead and create me a new one node camera. So I'll simply click on the icon under the rendering shell just to get a camera in the center. And then I'm going to rename that camera, quickly rename it, let's see, depth of field cam. So I'm going to rename it that so that I know what it is. And I'm going to switch my viewport from the perspective viewport to that DOF cam. Now I'm going to place this camera somewhere where I can actually activate that depth of field. Now, in order to understand depth of field, you need to have a little bit of understanding as to how lenses work in cameras. You would know by this point that a camera, in order to get good depth of field, you need to have a long lens. And a long lens means anything above 75 millimeters. Anything below that will give you very shallow depth of field, and you might not achieve the goal that you're looking for. So in this case, I want to go ahead and with the camera selected, I want to make sure that I change the focal length. By default, as we know, when we create one node cameras, the default is 35 mil. We want to change that to something way higher. So I'm going to go to, let's say 100 mil. So doing that will automatically switch my angle of view to make it wider. You'll notice that my scene got a lot more shallow. So I want to go ahead and place my camera even further to achieve this goal. Now, the goal is to get some of these things in focus while others get blurry as they're further back in the background. To do so, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and make sure that we activate the depth of field in the camera. So we'll go ahead and scroll down all the way to the Arnold drop-down menu. And then in here, we need to look for Enable Depth of Field. So with that enabled, we want to go ahead and start playing around with the focal length of this. Now this focal length, the distance to the lens, sorry, of the object that we want to have on focus. So for that, we need to start looking at where my actual focal point is on the camera versus the distance of the object that I'm trying to get in focus. So how do I go about doing that? Well, let's go ahead and start looking at focus distance. This right here under Arnold says focus distance is 5 points or 5 units. How far is this from my camera right now is what I need to know. To do so, I need to activate the heads-up display. So I go to display, heads-up display, and I want to look for the object details. Now you notice that when I open that, the fifth option down tells you how far that object is from the camera. So if I go and I select on that, it tells me it's about 66.9 units, so about 70 units. Let's see how far this one is. That's about 27 units. So I know that the distance to this point is 27 units. So if I were to select my camera and say, okay, since this is enabled, I want to make sure that anything that is at 27 units, it's in focus, then I'll just go ahead and switch that 5 to 27. And then I'll do a quick render. First, let me go ahead and, I have a light already on this. So I'm going to go ahead and do a quick render on Arnold. And with that done, you'll notice that everything seems to be in focus still. And the reason for that is because this number that we just worked on, the camera number that we just worked on, let me select the camera, basically it's looking not only at the distance, but at the aperture size. So it's basically the same way that it works in a DSLR camera when you're working with an actual lens. So if I increase, the more I increase the aperture of my lens, the quicker the things will become blurry when they're not on the focal distance that I'm working with. And the higher you go in that number, the blurrier they get. Now, getting these things blurry, it's one thing. It is another thing to control them. You can actually activate all these settings for how that blurriness looks by seeing how many blades you would have on that iris, the curvature of the aperture of the blade. I mean, you have all control of all these other things that you would have in an actual lens. The more you change these settings, the longer it's going to take to render because it's mimicking real life settings. And you might not get results as fast as or as close as you want them to real life. So be careful when working with these settings because you will be increasing your render time to make very slight changes that might not yield the result that you want. However, if you're looking for something very specific, this would be the point to find those numbers. This would be where you would change the attributes of the camera in order to match those of the real world. So let's go ahead and focus on this yellow one, for example. So let me select that one. That tells me that that is at 47.1 points. So I'm going to change my distance from 27 to, what was that? 47. So let's go ahead and change that to 47. And you'll see that as soon as I enter that number, the yellow cat comes into focus. Everything before it is getting on blurry because of the depth of field, and everything past that is also getting blurry. So the higher I increase the value of aperture size under Arnold, the higher the blurriness is on those other objects around my focal point. This is the way to create depth of field with Arnold.